My name is Chris Mann, and this is part 2 in my series of videos on the discussion between Sam Harris and Charles Murray. In the first part, I covered the rules of logical debate, and I gave you some background info that explains my thought process when it comes to Harris and race. So, if you haven't seen it yet, you may get confused because I'm not going to review much of it. In this video, after I cover Sam Harris's opening remarks at the beginning of his podcast, I'll be jumping into the meat of the discussion that Harris had with Murray. Now, last time I left off, I showed you that Harris implies here that it is morally bad for a person to act like a Nazi, a fascist, a white supremacist, or a eugenicist. I told you that he didn't define these terms, and he didn't distinguish between safe eugenics and dangerous eugenics in the way that Eric Weinstein would have wanted him to. Here, Harris says, "But what I found when I began reading Murray's work was a deeply rational and careful scholar who's quite obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society. This implies that the book's contents changed his mind in some way. It's as if he previously thought that any research into race and IQ is by necessity Nazi-like or careless. And then he discovered for the first time that it's possible for a person to scientifically study this issue without acting like a racist, depending on your definition of the word." Now, notice that Harris called Murray a deeply rational and careful scholar. It's almost like saying that Murray's views are rational or logical. But remember that Rule 2 of logical debate says that you must maintain that your views are logical until you change your mind, and change your mind only for logical reasons. So if Harris says that Murray's views are rational or logical, he has no choice but to adopt those views as his own. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say something like, "It's perfectly rational for a person to support banning all Muslim immigration," and then turn around and not support, banning all Muslim immigration. You can't give reasons against banning all Muslim immigration. So if you're not going to adopt a view, you can't declare it to be rational or logical according to this rule. Now, the other problem with this statement is that Harris seems to believe that Murray is obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society. Now, one possible interpretation of this is that Harris is saying that Murray does hold some normal moral views, so there's no need to worry that he's a so-called moral relativist. That would be a person who would be cold-hearted and like a calculating scientist who cares nothing about the morality of what he's studying. A person who's willing to search for the evidence no matter where it leads, and he doesn't care how much pain it'll cause to people. The other interpretation is that Harris thinks that Murray actually shares the same moral views as he does. Now, this is a beginning of a pattern in which Harris seems to project his moral views onto Murray. All right, and so you'll see further examples of this later. Here, Harris says, "Whatever the difference in average IQ is across groups, you know nothing about a person's intelligence on the basis of his or her skin color. That is just a fact." Now, first of all, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person knows something. So you're going to have to switch that to the next best scientifically provable human action, which would be something like to claim to know something. All right, now, besides that, Harris is going to have to be more careful with his thought process, because if you replace the words intelligence and average IQ here with the words crime rate, suddenly it becomes a statement that he doesn't agree with based on what he's said in other places. In other places, he has implied that he thinks that crime statistics about the different races are useful, and you can it is logical, in his opinion, to base decisions about how you treat someone based on the crime statistics of that person's race. Here, he says, there is much more variance among individuals in any racial group than there is between groups. There are questionable people who also say this. Any statistical difference is relevant to Harris on other issues. Whenever there's even a small statistical difference, Harris wants to be able to take advantage of that. And so, yeah, I was surprised to hear him say this as if he thinks it can be used as a counter-argument to some of the questionable people that tend to follow Harris. Yeah, so this statement isn't as powerful as he seems to think it is, and it misses the point in my view. Next, he says, so besides being unethical and politically imprudent, it is totally irrational to treat people as anything other than individuals. Now, this is better. This is a better statement because he implies that treating people as anything other than individuals is three things: morally bad, strategically bad, and illogical. Now, let me point out that there is some redundancy here because if an action is morally bad or strategically bad, it is illogical by definition, by the definition that I use. Now that he has implied that this action is morally bad, treating people as anything other than individuals. Now that he's implied that that is morally bad, he needs to define that action in terms of scientifically provable human actions. But he doesn't do it here. Okay, so in order to come up with a definition here that works, you would need to imagine what it would look like for someone to treat someone else as anything other than an individual. What would it look like on camera? What would count as scientific evidence to you that a person is actually doing this? What would that look like? So you can just ask yourself that in order to come up with a definition that will work here. Next, he says, Murray and Herrnstein were absolutely clear about this in the bell curve. Now, to be clear, I haven't read the whole book, so I don't really know if this is true or if they found a way to scientifically, or if they found a way to define this action in terms that are scientifically provable. I did read much of the book preview that's available on Google Books, though. I found much of it to be illogical. Yeah, there was much for me to disagree with, so maybe I'll give some details in a later video. Here, Harris says, so what happened to Murray, as far as I can tell, has had nothing to do with errors of scholarship, of which undoubtedly there must be some, or for the way he's conducted himself since, or for his personal motives for discussing these topics in the first place. Now, first of all, it's not possible to scientifically prove what a person's personal motives are. We can only use stated motives. You can only prove what a person's stated motives are. And, the thing is that Murray implied, plenty of motives and moral views in the book that I found to be problematic, so I can see why people would be upset with him. Now, what I mean is, once you've decided that someone did something morally bad, the next step is to decide what counts as criticism or discouragement of that action, and what is the appropriate amount of criticism or discouragement. What's the schedule that you should follow in criticizing or discouraging that action? You could decide that because of Murray's personality, his moral views are more likely to spread because he seems friendly, like a friendly guy. And so you could think his moral views are more likely to spread and be normalized, and then lead to negative outcomes in the future. So then it would be important to pull out all the stops now while you still can, and protest as strongly as possible. And then, even if Murray had been more like Steven Pinker and implied no moral views in the book, I mean, I haven't read Pinker's book, but I've seen him give a couple of talks on the subject, in which he implies virtually no moral views. So even if Murray had been more like Pinker, you could still reach the conclusion that strong protest is the way to go. Here, Harris says, rather, his scapegoating has been entirely the result of his having merely discussed differences in human intelligence at all. So you can see that Harris used the word scapegoating with a negative connotation. And so he's implying that it's morally bad for a person to strongly protest over something like this. Here, Harris says, but the efforts to invalidate the very notions of general intelligence and race have been wholly unconvincing from a psychometric and biological point of view, and are obviously motivated by a political discomfort in talking about these things. Now, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is feeling discomfort. So you would have to switch that to the next best scientifically provable human action, which might be to act as if a person is feeling discomfort. Yeah, so here you would have to ask yourself, what kinds of actions could be caught on camera that would scientifically prove to you that a person is acting as if they are feeling discomfort? Here, Harris says, and I understand and share that discomfort, but any fair reading of Murray would acknowledge that he understands and shares it too. So, Harris claims that he feels that which cannot be scientifically proven, and then he seems to project onto Murray again. He's projecting his moral views onto Murray. Murray did not say this, as far as I can tell, but we'll get into that. He goes on to say, whenever you see discussions of Murray, you can be sure that their authors felt themselves under immense pressure to dismiss it, and they wind up ignoring much of what Murray and Herrnstein actually wrote, and they argue in very sloppy ways against the concept of general intelligence. And this sloppiness still has the effect of being defamatory. So here he implies that it's morally bad for a person to defame someone, and he implies that his definition of to defame someone extends to what some people may have done if they decided that the best way to discourage actions that people like Murray do is to make false scientific claims. Now, this seems consistent with his earlier implied moral view that it's morally bad to misrepresent an opponent's views. But it's clearer now that he makes no exceptions for when people think that this kind of punishment for certain moral views is appropriate. Sometimes people think that in order to punish someone who did something that they think is morally bad, it's appropriate to misrepresent their views in some way or another, or to make some kind of false scientific statement. But here, Harris is implying that even after he accurately represents his opponent's views in a way that even they would say is accurate, he will criticize or discourage their actions in a way that includes no false scientific claims. But I don't think he's as good at this as he thinks he is. But I'll have to give some examples at some other time. At this point, you should start to wonder if there are any forms of criticism or discouragement of Murray's views that Harris would find to be not morally bad or maybe morally neutral. Because so far, Harris has only mentioned criticisms against Murray that Harris finds to be morally bad. Here, Harris talks about what happened years ago when he declined an offer to write for an academic journal, just because he discovered that Charles Murray was also going to be writing there. And he implies that he regrets his decision to decline that offer. Here, Harris says, "And I do remain skeptical about the wisdom of looking for cross-cultural or interracial differences in things like intelligence. I'm not sure what it gets you apart from a lot of pain. So many of the topics I discussed in the podcast with Murray are not topics I would ordinarily think about or recommend that you think about." And so we find out that even after talking to Charles Murray, because this part of the podcast was recorded after his discussion. So even after he talked to Murray about this stuff, he still has reservations about discussing the topic in the first place. He implies that it's strategically bad to think about this topic given the goal of avoiding a lot of pain, presumably the pain of having your reputation ruined. Now, of course, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is thinking about a topic. So you would have to change this and you would have to switch it to the next best scientifically provable human action, which might be something like to talk about this topic. So then that means that he's implying that it's strategically bad for a person to talk about this topic given the goal of avoiding a lot of damage to one's reputation. Now, it's somewhat of a relief to see that he still has reservations, but the view that he articulates right here, this concern for people's reputations, misses the point because it's merely a strategic view. It's not a moral view that he's implying here. Now, in contrast to that, you can just look at his next sentences. He says, "But the purpose of the podcast was to set the record straight because I find the dishonesty and hypocrisy and moral cowardice of Murray's critics shocking. And the fact that I was taken in by this defamation of him and effectively became part of a silent mob that was just watching what amounted to a modern witch burning, that was intolerable to me." So you can see here that he's implying moral views and not merely strategic views here. And we find out that he thought that the people who criticized or discouraged Murray's actions behaved so morally badly that Harris wanted to give Murray a platform and set the record straight, despite Harris's claimed discomfort and reservations about talking about this topic. Now, in my view, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is acting dishonestly, because that would require mind reading, unless you're talking about statements that are made on the record. Like if you openly declare that you are acting dishonestly, then that is provable. But besides that, it's not provable. And the accusation of hypocrisy here seems unsupported. You can't just assume what a person's moral views are. You have to wait for them to state their moral views officially and on the record. And then there's the term moral cowardice. This is really frustrating because, first of all, it's not defined here, but it may have something to do, it may be related to what he called a politically correct moral panic earlier. Because both of these terms imply something about fear affecting Murray's critics. Now, of course, you should know the pattern by now. You should be asking yourself, is it possible to scientifically prove that a person is acting like a coward? If so, how would you scientifically prove that someone is acting like a coward using today's science and technology? All right, now, I don't think it's possible to prove because it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is feeling fear. Anyway, Harris is implying that the people who strongly criticized or discouraged Murray's actions were acting like cowards. But but Harris is not acting like a coward because Harris is willing to talk to Murray. Now, all you have to do is replace the name Charles Murray with David Duke or Michael Cernovich or anyone that he said that he won't talk to see that he would be contradicting himself if this so-called moral cowardice is morally bad in his view. Now, let's get into the actual interview. Here, towards the beginning of the actual interview, Harris says to Murray, "And I just assumed you had said something in those pages that was so intellectually or morally indefensible that explained the backlash against you, and this is the backlash that continues to this day." Now, this is a little worrying to me because there's a really thin line between defending a position from illogical attacks and declaring that position to be logical. And I'm not completely sure that Harris won't imply that one of the problematic moral views that's implied in the book is actually logical. Harris has a tendency to declare that someone's views are rational or logical, and then try to find a way to not adopt those views. So that's why it's concerning that he would say this. Here, Harris says, "And it is just an amazing thing to be so slow to realize that. And first, I'd just like to apologize to you for having been so lazy and having been taken in to the degree that I was by the rumors and lies that have surrounded your work for the last 20 years. And I want to thank you doubly for coming on the podcast to talk about these things." So he apologizes to Murray and thanks him for agreeing to talk. He apologizes. So yeah, I couldn't believe it. So he seems committed to doing whatever he can to resurrect Charles Murray's reputation. And we might even see him go out of his way to defend Charles Murray, just like he did when he was defending Douglas Murray's comments on Polite Conversations, episode 17. Now, when you apologize for something, you imply that you did something morally bad and acted hypocritically. And when you thank someone for something, you imply that that person did something morally good. So he implies here that he believes it's morally bad for a person to avoid proximity to controversial people without first doing research on them. And he implies it's morally good for a person to agree to talk to people less controversial than oneself upon request. The thing to remember here is that there's a long list of people that Harris explicitly said he wouldn't talk to because of the controversy surrounding them and the fact that he doesn't have time to research. And the fact that he doesn't have time to research all of their past statements to see if the accusations are warranted. Now that Harris has implied that he did something morally bad when he avoided proximity to Murray, that implies in turn that he actually had time to research Murray, but he was lazy and chose not to. Now, that means it's possible that he's acting hypocritically right now by avoiding people he has time to research while claiming he doesn't have time to research them. So, it all depends on how he spends his time each day. If I had the chance, I would ask Harris how much potentially free time a person can have each day before they become guilty of avoiding proximity to controversial people without first doing research. I shudder to think of what'll happen when he discovers that a lot of these controversial people have nice personalities and claim that they want what's best. Will he apologize to them too? Here, Harris expresses determination to ram past listeners' resistance to changing their minds. Now, with this, he seems to be dismissing concerns about downstream effects. Like concerns about how this information could be used in the future. And that's part of a continuing pattern that we're going to see. Here, Harris says, I want to get to the most controversial points you make in the book and what you actually say about them, and what kind of public policy recommendations you make on their basis, because it is the opposite of a white supremacist neo-Nazi book, and you have been called both of those things. So here, Harris is implying that Murray is not a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi, but that depends on the definitions of those words. There are people with looser definitions of those words, so it's relevant what his definition of that is. For example, Richard Spencer denies being a white supremacist. And I think Spencer also claims that neo-Nazi groups hate him. Harris doesn't always take into account what people self-identify as. Remember that Harris's earlier definition of to act like a racist seemed to include to act like a segregationist or white nationalist. So, with this statement here, it seems as if as long as someone doesn't openly support physically separating the races, they are not beyond the pale for Harris. Here, Harris says, already you seem to be opening the door to eugenics and other scary ethical and political ways of thinking. And then when you add to that the fact that there are detectable differences in mean IQ between races, then just everything goes completely haywire for people. So once again, he used eugenics as an example of a scary ethical or political way of thinking, without distinguishing between what Weinstein would call safe eugenics and dangerous eugenics. Here, Harris says, that's also another wrinkle here which I think adds to people's concerns about talking about this whole area, this lack of anything obvious to do about remedying any inequalities we find here. So here he acknowledges that there are concerns about this area, but he characterizes those concerns as being based on a lack of anything obvious to do about remedying IQ inequalities. Now, I think he means that there's no obvious way to improve people's IQs, but his wording here leaves out morality completely, and so his wording implies that there are no obvious ideas about what to do to people with low IQs. But of course, I can think of things that, I can imagine what some people would want to do to people with low IQs. Alright, now here, Murray says, and if there is one lesson that we have learned from the last 70 years of social policy, it is that changing environments in ways that produce measurable results is really, really hard. And actually, we don't know how to do it no matter how much money we spend. Now, the thing to know about Murray is that he's a self-described libertarian. So, whenever there's a choice, he'll tend to choose the option that involves less government intervention, which means fewer government programs, less government regulation, lower taxes, and free market capitalism. So, what he's implying here is that the last 70 years of government policies have resulted in little progress, so the government shouldn't spend hardly any money on it at all anymore. So you can see here how he found a way to imply that the libertarian position is the best one without even discussing other possible solutions. Now, debating with libertarians can be tough enough as it is, because some of them build a strong case based purely on true or apparently true statements about economics, while largely following the rules that I set out about logical debate. Now, the problem that I have with Murray is that his case for libertarianism is partially based on social arguments about gender and race differences. Therefore, my objections to Murray's arguments will be a combination of my counter arguments to libertarianism in general, along with my arguments against how he talks about racial and gender issues. Here, Murray says, there are no obvious ways that you can deal with a non-shared environment in the way that you can say, oh, we can improve the schools, we can teach better parenting practices, we can provide more money for whatever you want to provide money for. So here he's implying these three things are pointless because they'll have no effect on the personality of children. They'll have no effect on the personality of the children they are trying to help. He's a libertarian though, so what he's really implying is that it's pointless for the government to try to improve schools. It's pointless for the government to try to improve parenting practices, and it's pointless for the government to provide money for almost anything at all. So if you pressed him, I think he'd probably say that it's not pointless for the private sector to improve schools or to improve parenting books or to invest in almost anything at all. So far, this is standard libertarianism. But later, he'll imply that because it's pointless for the government to try to improve schools, the government shouldn't try to improve failing schools in black neighborhoods. Now, the following exchange that they have is important. Murray says, at this point, I don't know of anybody who's familiar with the literature who thinks that there is that much of a role left of the kind that parents thought they had in shaping their children. Harris, right, well, I'm not going to stop trying, I think. It's a very hard delusion to cut through as I read Harry Potter tonight to my eldest daughter. Murray, but I think it's good to reflect on that. Reading Harry Potter to your eldest daughter is a good in itself. And the fact that she behaves differently 20 years from now is not the point. Harris, exactly. It is an intrinsic good, and it's for my own pleasure that I do it largely at this point. So, here, Murray claims that it's a well-established scientific fact that parents have less of an effect on their children's personalities than they tend to claim they have. Now, whether or not this is true is a matter for scientific debate. When Harris says that he'll still read to his daughter, Murray implies that it's morally good for a person to read to his or her daughter. Now, whether or not this is true is a matter for moral debate. So, to me, Murray's statements imply that he knows about the is-ought gap, and so he knows it's technically possible for someone to, without contradiction, both acknowledge that average IQ differences are real, and for moral reasons, oppose efforts to change government policies that try to improve failing schools. He seems to be okay with parents who have moral reasons for not changing their parenting behavior based on new scientific findings, but he seems to expect everyone to no longer support government efforts to improve schools based on new scientific findings. If I had the chance, I would ask Murray what he would think of parents who acknowledge that reading to their children doesn't change their personality, while still sending their children to public schools and still supporting having the schools read to their children for moral reasons. Now here, I just want to let the record show that here Harris acknowledges that there's a concern, but he gives no specifics about it. And they've been talking for 30 minutes at this point. So here, Harris says, there are many things that IQ is correlated with. High IQ is correlated with things like liberal values and things like being less racist and less authoritarian and less sexist, even less religious, in particular, less fundamentalist in your religiosity. So he mentions racism and sexism again here, but he doesn't define these things. And he says all of this as if he got this from the bell curve. But if these things were defined in terms of scientifically provable human actions in the book, that would mean that Harris and Murray share an understanding of these words that I don't have. I don't have access to. Yeah, I haven't read the whole book. I haven't bought the whole. I haven't bought the book. But it would be interesting to see if they tried to define these things in the book. All right, in this part, they start talking about the usefulness of IQ testing in general. There's no mention of concerns here. Here, Murray says, ordinary people are perfectly comfortable with the idea that some people are smarter than others. They're perfectly comfortable that what we call smart gets you kinds of jobs you can't get otherwise. All that kind of stuff. It's the elites who are under the impression that, oh, IQ tests only measure what IQ tests measure. And nobody really is able to define intelligence, and this and that. They're culturally biased, on and on and on and on. All of these things are the equivalent of saying the earth is flat. Now, this seems to support my claim that Harris is projecting his own moral views onto Murray. Murray is directly contradicting what Harris said earlier. Remember that earlier, Harris said this, but the efforts to invalidate the very notions of general intelligence and race have been wholly unconvincing from a psychometric and biological point of view, and are obviously motivated by a political discomfort in talking about these things. And I understand and share that discomfort, but any fair reading of Murray would acknowledge that he understands and shares it too. And Harris said this part after having recorded the interview in which Murray said in which Murray implied the opposite. Because Murray here is implying that he's perfectly comfortable with talking about this topic. Now, what Murray seems to be missing is that ordinary people tend to claim that it's morally bad for a person to participate in safe eugenics or dangerous eugenics. So, when normal people talk about IQ differences, they do so with the expectation that the conversation won't turn to using safe or dangerous eugenics to deal with people with low IQs. The elites who opposed this research seem to have done so based on concerns and issues of morality. So, why does Murray speak as if he doesn't know this? This is from page 9 of the bell curve. Asked by the review's editors to consider why compensatory and remedial education programs begun with such high hopes during the war on poverty had yielded such disappointing results, Jensen concluded that the programs were bound to have little success because they were aimed at populations of youngsters with relatively low IQs, and success in school depended to a considerable degree on IQ. IQ had a large heritable component, Jensen also noted. The article further disclosed that the youngsters in the targeted populations were disproportionately black, and that historically, blacks as a population had exhibited average IQs substantially below those of whites. The reaction to Jensen's article was immediate and violent. From 1969 through the mid-1970s, dozens of books and hundreds of articles appeared denouncing the use of IQ tests and arguing that mental abilities are determined by environment, with the genes playing a minor role and race none at all. Just from this passage, you could guess that the elites opposed to Jensen, which is Arthur Jensen, they opposed IQ tests out of moral concerns. Notice that the authors here implied no moral views. This is just a detached, these are just detached statements about what happened historically. On page 10, they go on to say, the uproar was exacerbated by William Shockley, who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to the invention of the transistor, but had turned his attention to human variation towards the end of his career. As eccentric as he was brilliant, he often recalled the eugenicists of the early decades of the century. He proposed, as a thought exercise, a scheme for paying people with low IQs to be sterilized. He supported and contributed to a sperm bank for geniuses. He seemed to relish expressing sensitive scientific findings in a way that would outrage or disturb as many people as possible. Again, it seems clear to me why there would be an uproar over Shockley. And again, the authors implied no moral views here. They didn't condemn anything that Arthur Jensen or William Shockley did. Now, it would be one thing if they wanted to keep their scientific views separate from their moral views, and they put their scientific views here and expressed their moral views later in the book. But I think that I've shown that even in this recent interview, Murray is speaking as if he doesn't know that his opponents have concerns about morality and how this information could be used. Now I'd like to make a small correction about what I said in part 1 of this series. I said that a lot of Jews, including Murray's co-author Herrnstein, asked Murray to not publish the fact that Jews have the highest IQs on average, and I claimed that Murray seemed to take this as them merely being humble, and I claimed that he didn't realize that there is a worldview that this kind of information could be used to justify. Since then, I have found an article that Murray wrote for a Commentary magazine in 2007. He says, since its first issue in 1945, Commentary has published hundreds of articles about Jews and Judaism. As one would expect, they cover just about every important aspect of the topic. But there's a lacuna, and not one involving some obscure bit of Judaica. Commentary has never published a systematic discussion of one of the most obvious topics of all, the extravagant overrepresentation of Jews relative to their numbers in the top ranks of the arts, sciences, law, medicine, finance, entrepreneurship, and the media. Okay, so in the first paragraph here, he's speaking as if he's completely oblivious to why it is that this hasn't been covered. And how could he not know, right? So this shows that there's a long-term pattern in the way he speaks. And then in the next paragraph, he implies that he actually does know the reason. He says, I have personal experience with the reluctance of Jews to talk about Jewish accomplishment. My co-author, the late Richard Herrnstein, gently resisted the paragraphs on Jewish IQ that I insisted on putting in the bell curve. Both history and the contemporary revival of anti-Semitism in Europe make it easy to understand the reasons for that reluctance. But Jewish accomplishment constitutes a fascinating and important story. Recent scholarship is expanding our understanding of its origins. And then, in the rest of the article, he goes on to explain his theory about how Jews evolved to have such high average IQs. The overall tone is congratulatory, and he praises Jews as God's chosen people at the end. So I was wrong before. He did acknowledge, in 2007 at least, that there's a worldview that this information could be used to justify. That there are concerns about how this information could be used to perpetuate anti-Semitism, which he mentions here, but doesn't define, and he doesn't imply that it's morally bad. Instead, he seems to dismiss these concerns by starting the next sentence with "but." And then he gives a positive argument for covering this topic anyway. So he doesn't argue against anti-Semitism or say how he will protect people from it, or how he'll discourage it, or he doesn't criticize it or anything. He just says something like, "But look on the bright side." Something like, "Oh, I acknowledge your concern that anti-Semitism may spread because of my research, but my research tells a fascinating story." Or he's saying something like, "To Gad Saad, I acknowledge your concern that 95% of unvetted Muslim immigrants from some country may have homicidal levels of anti-Semitism, but if we let them in unvetted, we could more easily hear their music and taste their food." So hopefully you can see why people with concerns would still be concerned, no matter how much praise for Jewish accomplishments that Murray then heaps on top. Here, Charles Murray defines predictive validity, and he uses statistical correlations. He talks about statistical correlations to support his view that IQ test results are useful, but he doesn't mention concerns here, and which is part of the other pattern. Just so you know, he's advocating for IQ tests because he wants a Supreme Court ruling overturned. There was a Supreme Court ruling that said that employers can't use general IQ tests to help choose who to hire, and that employers can only use tests that are narrowly designed to test for the skills needed for the job. This restriction was put in place because if employers could use general IQ tests, the Supreme Court was concerned that some blacks would be kept from getting jobs they would otherwise be qualified to do. At one point in the book, Murray argues that people who do well on those narrow skills tests and therefore seem to be qualified to do the job are actually not as productive on average as those who do well on general IQ tests. In other words, the lower a person's IQ, the more lazy the person is. So you can see that he's using economic arguments to argue for removing a restriction on employers that was meant to protect minorities. Now, if you think about it, this still falls under the umbrella of libertarianism. It fits the overall desire of libertarians to reduce and remove all government restrictions on the free market. The difference between Murray and other kinds of libertarians is that Murray doesn't tend to acknowledge concerns, as I've shown, and he doesn't seem satisfied with the eventual removal of anti-discrimination measures. His focus on this issue implies that he wants those anti-discrimination measures removed sooner than later, sooner than other measures that also restrict the free market even. So in short, his proposed schedule for how we can reach a libertarian utopia is problematic. Moving on, he says, we're not helpless to simply say, well, there's still racism existing, so that must be the explanation. There are lots of ways that we can look at patterns in the data and say, well, are these compatible with an exclusively environmental explanation? So there's a couple of things I want to point out here. The first thing to notice is that he isn't implying that racism is morally bad, nor is he implying that racism still exists. Now, he implied those things elsewhere, but it's important for you to be able to tell when it's happening and when it's not happening. Because the frequency of criticism or discouragement of morally bad actions will become relevant in later on in debates like this. The other thing to notice here is the false choice he starts to set up. It's like either you agree with him completely, or you are claiming that racism and other environmental factors account for 100% of the racial differences. A lot is riding on exactly what claim he expects you to agree with him on. If it's the claim that racial differences are partially genetic and partially environmental, then that would be one thing. But look at what he says later. He says, there is an asymmetry between saying probably genes have some involvement and the assertion that it's entirely environmental. And that's the assertion being made. And that is the assertion that's being made. If you're going to be upset at the bell curve, you are obligated to defend the proposition that the black-white difference in IQ scores is 100% environmental. This sounds like he expects agreement on the whole book. As I've shown, though, there is plenty of things in the book that one could disagree with, and I may get around to quoting more from the book in a later video. That does it for this one.